The next painter I want to look at with you is George Seurat. And Seurat was a painter who he died very young. I think he was kind of a workaholic and he worked himself to death. And his idea about Impressionism is a little bit different, and he comes up with a post-impressionist form called pointillism or divisionism. And we're going to understand what that is by, you have to zoom in on the painting to actually see it. But I wanted to show you the painting, how large it is and how imposing it is in a way. And it almost looks like a picturesque postcard of some people going to Parisian parks. And even the scale of the painting, obviously he couldn't have painted this plein air or out of doors on location, and he painted in his studio. There's some stories that he actually almost digitized his color. He would take big blocks of paint, mix them up in cups, and he would paint by gaslight rather than painting out of doors with real light. There's also a little bit of a problem with the chemistry of the paints, just to mention this, that I've heard about, that he used some chemicals like chrome yellow that tended to turn a little bit strangely colored or tarnish over time. So the paintings that we're looking at now are not the paintings that they made at the time that they made them, and I think that's important. We'll talk about the content of this painting first, because I think that that is very interesting, and if we talk about the content, then we can also talk about the formal qualities, because I think this is really a painting that documents a lot of things that were going on in Paris at that time. To begin with, this is a lot like Gustave Caillebott's painting Paris, a Rainy Day, in that it documents some of the changes that happened really in the middle 1800s in Paris. Remember, we talked about in the lecture on Paris in general that Baron Haussmann had redesigned all of Paris more or less under the instruction of, I think it was Louis Philippe, it might have been Napoleon III. And what happened was, in the process of reorganizing and gentrifying and rebuilding all of downtown Paris, they also built a series of parks. This is also combined with the fact that the work week kind of gets shorter and shorter over time. People have more leisure time. I think it dropped down to a 6-day work week, and instead of a 14-hour workday, something like a 10-hour workday, something along those lines. So on the weekends, people actually had time to go out and enjoy the parks, and the parks were a big democratizing agent in Parisian society because they were open to all and there was no cost. So what Seurat is showing you is actually a Sunday afternoon in the park on the island of La Grande Chatte, which was, I think it was actually a little man-made island that people could go out. You might want to check the fact on that. And he's painting all of these people who have come together in the park, and you can see that there are different classes of people who are commingling. And so if we start in the lower left-hand corner, you see there's a man reclining who's smoking a pipe, and he's got this big hound dog behind him. And notice that he's closer to the earth, he's more comfortable in nature. And I think that somewhat refers to some of the ideas earlier from the 1700s and early 1800s, in which Jean-Jacques Rousseau kind of advocates a return to nature, and the fact that, especially in French literature of the day, you see that a lot of depictions of people who are of the lower classes and peasant classes is considered to be a very sympathetic point of view of them, that they are good, wholesome people and they're closer to the earth. And if you look behind him, you can see how uncomfortable the other two people look, especially the man with the top hat. It's almost like he's uncomfortable to sit on the grass, he's going to get his clothing dirty and that kind of thing. So it kind of shows also an upper bourgeois, possibly a businessman who's out for a jaunt on a Sunday afternoon. If you ever get a chance and you feel like watching some films about this, there's a film called Camille Claudel, which with Gérard Depardieu, which kind of shows some of this stuff. And another really great movie is My Father's Castle. On the right-hand side, we see another couple, and we'll start with the costume first, just because it's kind of an interesting thing. Proper women, or most women, wore parasols because it was fashionable to be very pale at that point in time. People who worked outdoors got a lot of color, so it would show that you were not of the working classes if you were pale. And the clothing that she's wearing, you can see that exaggerated hump on the back of her dress, which is called a bustle. And the bustle that we're looking at is actually a way of sort of exaggerating the feminine form. And women wore corsets and bustles at that point of time, and it was a way of expressing sort of wealth in a way, and it was a fashion statement. You can see that she's walking with a top-hatted gentleman, and he has a walking stick as well, so he obviously has some money. She's got two exotic pets in front of her. One is this scampering little toy dog, and then another one is a monkey that she's got sort of chained up. And if you recall from earlier paintings that we've looked at, for instance, Manet has that black cat, and also in Titian's Venus of Urbino, there's this toy dog in there. Usually the women who are of upper classes, and this is sort of a stereotype, but a lot of women are depicted in literature and film as having exotic pets or cute little doggies, and it somehow enhances their appeal to the males that they're seeking to appeal to. In this instance, what I gathered from some of my lectures from Professor Diane McLeod at University of California, Davis, she discussed this painting in particular, and she said that that woman is probably a sort of prostitute or a kept woman. And one of the ways that you would identify a prostitute or a kept woman was that she would have these exotic pets like a monkey. I also think that probably what Seurat is referencing is the idea of a monkey on one's back, and that could also relate to when we looked at Hogarth, The Rake's Progress. There's a monkey running through the house, and the prostitute probably owns this exotic pet. So I think it's kind of an icon of women who are kept or women who are involved in prostitution to have exotic pets like that. And I think it's kind of an interesting idea. So we see all that in this painting. Now, I want to move into some of the formal realms of talking about this painting and talk about how it's divisionist and pointillist. First thing I want you to notice is the sort of frame on the painting, and I'll zoom in on it. If you notice on the frame, he actually paints a frame on this painting that's in contrasting value, which means shading, and also contrasting color to try to set off the colors inside. If you look at this other photo from the Art Institute, you can see that actually they framed the painting so that you could see the frame that Seurat painted. And that's a common thing that he does, is he wants everybody to see that he paints a complementary color outline or frame around it to set off the colors inside, because he felt that his use of color would make paintings much more exciting. Okay. Now I want to zoom in or show you some ideas about Seurat and his painting. And if you look at these three pictures, they're slightly different from the ones that I showed you, for instance, about Cézanne. You have the original picture in the upper left-hand corner, then you have the intensified color. But what Seurat did is he actually decided he was going to paint brilliant dots of color that were isolated from one another, so that when you zoomed in on each thing, the color would scintillate. So he intensifies the color and hue of each dot, and as you move away from the dots, they combine and mix in your eye, and this optical mixing in your eye is designed to make the colors look more brilliant. So I reproduced that in Photoshop, but let's take a look at some of the details of his paintings to see it in person. This is a close-up of that gentleman who was sitting on the ground, and you can see that he's using a lot of non-local colors, these blues and purpley kinds of colors, and he's contrasting warm and cool against one another. You can see the texture of the canvas, and you can see that he actually paints little discrete dots that when you move away from the painting, they combine to make an entire sort of tableau or scene and to create value structure and a transition of color. If we look at the landscape a little bit more closely, you can see he really does this very roughly in the background of some of his paintings. And when you move away from it, they blend together almost like if you take a magnifying glass to an old photograph in a magazine, you can see those dots that cluster together to make color. That's what Monet was doing with the broken brushwork, and that's what Seurat was doing with these little dots. Another good painting to look at is some of the studies that he did, because you can see his thought process in looking at the studies. If you zoom in on the painting, you can see that they're very roughly defined. He hasn't worked out all the details, but you can see that he's experimenting with color. He's experimenting with large generalized forms. He's putting together his idea. Notice the monkey's there, but not the dog. The big hound dog is there. And if you look closely at the edges, you can also see that he has the painted border that's meant to set off the colors. A really great painting that I wanted to bring up to you that's available in the Bay Area, and since I teach in the Bay Area, I just wanted to point this out at the San Francisco Museum of Fine Art, the Legion of Honor. They usually have this exhibited. It's a pretty tiny painting. It's only 9.5 inches by 6 inches, and it's a painting of the Eiffel Tower. And you can see all of the things that I was talking to you about, that it's actually a complete painting that is done with sort of these dots that combine in your eyes together. He has the frame around the outside. But if we zoom in on the painting, it really gives you a sense of how he worked and how the dots divided up and how the optical mixing was supposed to be working to show you these Parisian scenes.